works towards a healthier and fairer food system. We do so by driving greater transparency and accountability on the part of the food industry, particularly as it relates to corporations' engagement in our political systems and our policy processes. And that's why we're here today. We know that global food corporations, next slide please, have tremendous influence over everything from how and what we eat to what food is produced and how it's grown. And this influence is a result of policy. The enormous market power that the food industry has translates into political power, and that political power is used by corporations to maintain their market dominance. These corporations do everything they can to obscure the nature of this power because it's generally not aligned to the values and the value proposition they're selling to us stakeholders. So amidst rising global hunger and the epidemic of obesity and a climate breakdown, calls for food system transformations have grown more numerous and more urgent. But a broken food system is a symptom of a broken political system, one in which vast amounts of corporate money pours into the system to secure access to policy and to influence policymaking in ways that are hidden from view. Truth is, we know very little about how corporations operate to gain political advantage. We know that the food industry has lobbied to keep junk food in schools, sugary sodas cheap, wages low for frontline workers, and regulation to protect our environment from harmful agricultural practices off the table. And big food uses the same playbook as big tobacco and big oil, one laid out for the world to see earlier this year when the ExxonMobil lobbyist was caught on tape admitting that the company funds aggressive lobbying efforts to deny climate science and support for shadowy groups that oppose climate policy. But stakeholders are demanding greater transparency. Next slide. And this pressure has accelerated particularly in light of the recent political events in the US, namely the violent attack on the US Capitol. These events have prompted greater scrutiny on corporate political activity and is fueling a movement to rein in corporate power in politics. And investors are at the forefront of these issues. So while investors, socially responsible investors, have been raising concerns about the secretive nature of corporate political activity for some time, recently, there's been a renewed interest on the part of mainstream investors. Vanguard, one of the world's largest investors, cautioned that poor governance of corporate political activity can manifest into financial, legal, and reputational risks for companies. But yet, despite this surge of interest from investors and other stakeholders, the little information exists actually about how global food corporations are shaping policy and bending political systems to their will. And this lack of transparency means we don't know the full extent of to which corporations are driving agendas on food system transformations or public health or human rights or the environment. So that's why we at Feed the Truth created the Food and Agriculture Corporate Transparency Index, or FACT Index for short. Next slide, please. The FACT Index is a starting point to develop an evidence base around the political activity of some of the world's largest food corporations. And our intent with the FACT Index is to make visible just how transparent the world's largest global food and agriculture corporations are when it comes to using their political power to shape policy. Through the FACT Index, we take a more holistic view of the activities that the industry uses to drive policy agendas. And we examine these activities across 4 dimensions: lobbying, political campaign donations and other election-related spending, corporate-funded scientific research, and charitable giving. And taken together, these forms of corporate political activity constitute a playbook that's used by food corporations in different ways the world over. Next slide. So to develop the FACT Index, we chose to analyze political disclosures for a set of the 10 largest food, beverage, and agriculture corporations by annual revenue. And we included a cross-section of privately owned and publicly traded corporations, as well as corporations based in the US and overseas. And our analysis centered on these corporations because their size enabled them to spend a significant amount of money to influence policy throughout the world. We excluded corporations that derive a majority of their sales from alcoholic beverages, as well as retailers. And so using publicly available information from the companies, we assess corporations on a scale of 0 to 100 based on the extent to which they publicly disclose their spending across these 4 dimensions. High score reflects a significant amount of disclosure, and a low score reflects a low level of disclosure. And corporations that have a publicly available policy prohibiting spending or activity in any of these categories get the maximum number of points. So what is this index telling us? Well, we found that the world's leading food corporations are failing to disclose some of the most basic information about their political activity, and it illustrates how much room for improvement there is. So for example, out of a possible total score of 100, agribusiness giant Bunge and Tyson's Food scored an abysmal 2 and 3 points respectively because of their complete lack of information on how they use shareholder money to lobby and fund political campaigns. And even though Nestle and Unilever signed a pledge at Davos earlier this year, committing to publish information on a set of environmental, social, and governance metrics ranging from greenhouse gas emissions to board diversity, those 2 corporations provide little transparency when it comes to their political spending. And as the highest ranking score on the FACT index, Coca-Cola gets a score of only 41 because while it partially discloses information on all 4 categories, the global soda giant does so only for activities in the US and not in the other 200 countries it operates in. So the truth is the world's largest food corporations can't claim to be accountable to their stakeholders when there is such little openness about how these corporations are operating politically. And what we also found is that these corporations don't disclose voluntarily information. Disclosures are either compelled by law or come as a result of dedicated investor pressure or public campaigns or negative media visibility. So it's important to note that a significant amount of corporate political spending is not required to be disclosed under current laws, either in the US or globally. So now let's take a quick look at disclosures in each of the 4 areas. Next slide. So the electioneering category accounts for close to half of the FACT score, and it includes corporate spending to influence electoral outcomes, such as the election of public officials or voting on ballot measures. And disclosure of this spending, which includes political campaign contributions, offer a window into how food corporations not only influence policy decisions, but ensures that decision makers will closely align to their prerogatives. In this category, as I mentioned earlier, 2 companies failed to make disclosures public, and corporations disclose very little in terms of political contributions outside of the US. On the bright side, 2 companies did make clear they don't make political contributions anywhere, and that's Mars and Unilever. Next slide. The lobbying category accounts for roughly 1/3 of the FACT index scores, and it refers to any activity directly or indirectly to influence the decision or action of government officials, legislatures, or regulatory agencies. And these disclosures provide a view of which people, lobbyists, and which institutions, trade groups are paid to persuade public officials. Overall, there's a global lack of disclosure around lobbying, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later from the Access to Nutrition Initiative. Only 22 countries regulate lobbying at all, but lobbying disclosures are pretty limited and enforcement is weak. Here again, the bottom 2 corporations, Bunge and Tyson's, failed to make any disclosures public on their lobbying, while Coca-Cola was ranked near the top. Next slide, please. Then let's take a look at the charity category. So charity refers, of course, to disclosures of donations made by corporations to charitable organizations. And while some charitable contributions can be well-intentioned, much corporate philanthropy is politically motivated. And there's research to back this up. Researchers recently estimated that as much as $1 billion a year of corporate philanthropy is used to sway congressional representatives in the US. And they characterize corporate philanthropy as a form of corporate political influence. In reality, charity is a way for corporations to mute criticism, ward off regulations, and create a halo around their brand. And so in terms of disclosures, ADM and Unilever failed to make public any of its charitable giving. Coca-Cola ranks at the top, and it may be in part because of the controversy that was generated when the New York Times revealed that Coca-Cola was secretly funding the Global Energy Balance Network based at the University of Colorado to promote messages that sugar-sweetened beverages are no more responsible for the rise of obesity than any other foods or lack of physical activity. Next slide. The science category refers to disclosure of any spending to influence scientific studies or institutions. So corporate scientific activities are designed to manufacture an evidence base, which is used to inform policymaking. And this includes funding nutrition research, sponsoring scientific seminars, funding scientific front groups, and even delivering nutrition education program. And while Nestle ranked most highly in this category, thanks to its significant global disclosures, Pepsi, Unilever, ADM, JBS, Bunge, and Mars all failed to disclose any of their research underwriting. Next slide. So we created the fact index because we know that the scale of these corporations' political activities is immense, and it's often inconsistent with their stated values. And in many ways, that means that corporations' political power can be a threat to global governance, particularly of food systems. It's important to have a greater visibility and understanding of the biggest food corporations' political activities and to expose the disconnect between corporations' political spending and their stated values, and highlight this as a risk for investors, certainly, but a risk for all stakeholders that interact with these corporations. Ultimately, we want greater transparency, and in many cases, we want corporations to completely stop engaging in political interference. Next slide. So we have a set of recommendations. So first up, for corporations. So we want global food corporations to start leading the way in opening their books on their political giving. We're calling on corporations to publicly disclose the totality of their political activities, and that is in all the geographies that they do business in, not just the US, where some disclosure is legally mandated. I think corporations are learning the hard way that political transparency is part of the cost of doing business. And the small act of putting information on a corporate website about corporations' political contributions, trade association memberships, and lobbying expenditure can mean the difference between being praised as a leader or criticized as a laggard. And Coca-Cola and other corporations are proving that heightened transparency is possible. Next, for investors, we know that corporations aren't being more transparent out of goodwill. Their stakeholders are actually demanding it. Investors want to know what they're investing in and that their investments are increasingly good for people and planet, and that requires a greater level of openness. And this is evident in the shareholder advocacy that we're starting to see. Earlier this year, the large institutional investor Vanguard proposed a shareholder resolution and voted in favor of a shareholder resolution requiring Tyson's to be more transparent and detail out its lobbying activities after the company lobbied the Trump administration to keep line speeds moving quickly at its meat processing plants, which exacerbated the spread of COVID in those areas. And so it's essential that investors call on corporations for this kind of transparency and hold corporate executives accountable for how shareholder money is spent on political engagement. And finally, governments. So there's not just a need for voluntary corporate commitments, but stronger national and global sunshine laws. There are very few requirements for corporations to disclose what trade groups they're part of, what election officials they contribute to, et cetera. And stronger regulation on this front puts corporations all on equal footing and truly codifies the need for political transparency as a requirement for doing business. So at the end of April, the European Union approved a new set of rules that made their voluntary transparency register mandatory, and that registers include spending estimates and other things. And in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, under the Biden administration, is looking at rules to make disclosures on corporate political activities mandatory. So the tide, hopefully, is turning. But we have, I think, only a few weeks left until the actual Food System Summit in September. So the challenge I want to put out to corporations today is to open your books and to try to increase your FACT scores by the time that the UN Food System Summit rolls around, and provide more information about the lobbying, the campaign contributions, the science, and the charities that you are funding. So I'll leave it there, and I want to now turn it to Mark Vina for some commentary and insight on how the FACT Index can help amplify other corporate accountability efforts, such as the Access to Nutrition Index. Mark leads the research for the Access to Nutrition Initiative, and a variety of projects within the Access to Nutrition Initiative to improve the private sector's accountability to contribute to addressing malnutrition challenges globally. And he joined ATNI in September. Before that, he worked as an international nutrition on international nutrition and health challenges. He was the advocacy officer of children's rights and business at UNICEF Netherlands. And in this role, he was responsible for working with public and private sector stakeholders in the food and beverage value chain to improve positive health outcomes for children and minimize negative impacts. He holds an MSc in human nutrition from Wageningen University. Mark, thank you for joining us. Over to you now.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Feed the Truth team, for inviting me and ATNI to present what we in ATNI deal with when we assess companies' contributions to malnutrition, as you said, globally. We are an accountability mechanism producing an index or benchmark of the 25 largest food and beverage manufacturers globally. And we look at all the aspects which influence nutrition and malnutrition challenges globally. So both undernutrition and overweight and obesity related problems. So in our index, we, for that reason, focus very much on the quality, the nutritional quality of products, looking at ingredients and macronutrients, micronutrients. We look at marketing practices of companies, the way they label products, the way they deal with their employees, the way their governance and management systems are set up to support tackling malnutrition. And one of the aspects we also look at is what we call the engagement of these companies with their surroundings. And the category which looks at that has again two subtopics. One is engagement with civil society stakeholders and academia, and the other one is very specifically looking at lobbying and support to government programs. And I think that's the topic of today's meeting and the FACT index. So I'll try to show you a bit what our global indexes, which are our flagship products. We produced 4 so far, starting in 2013, and the 4th global index was just released 1 month ago for 2021, including the 25 largest food manufacturers. We also produce country level indexes looking at the largest food and beverage manufacturers in certain markets, for instance, India and the United States. And we also, since the onset of the COVID pandemic, try to specifically monitor what food and beverage companies have been doing in response to the pandemic. And today happens to be the day that we produce the 4th of a quarterly report on this very specific topic, showing that many of the companies' responses over the last year have been quite ad hoc. There have been a lot of good examples, but also in the different fields I mentioned, a very mixed picture. But focusing on lobbying in the next slide, please, I'll show you that our global index and also some of our spotlight indexes in this category, looking at engagement specifically, have indicators looking at what commitments and policies do companies have to regulate their lobbying and their influencing of governments. Do they have management systems like whistleblowing mechanisms, or they have assigned their board to overlook the lobbying activities, and do they audit it? And then, as the fact index does, we also look at the disclosure and of the efforts in lobbying. Our 2021 global index showed that this is still an area where a lot of improvement can be made by companies. After the 25 companies scored an average 2.9, and that's on our index on a scale of 0 to 10. So 2.9 is very low. It's even a bit lower than in the previous 2018 index. But having said that, we do see some positive developments that more companies specifically show what topics like front of pack labeling or health claims they lobby for, and what their position on that is. That's more than we saw in the previous index, but still a long way to go. Of the 25 companies we assessed, only 2 companies publicly state that their lobbying will only be in support of public health priorities set by governments. So that's a very low number. So a long way to go. Next slide, please. Our indicators on this topic have been through the years developed, and we use that experience to contribute with our organizations to the development of a responsible lobbying framework, which was released last year. And we also use the experience with the responsible lobbying framework to fine-tune our indicators in the category in the global index focusing on lobbying. It's basically to make clear what international standards and organizations expect of companies when we talk about responsible lobbying. And of course, there's many reasons for encouraging responsible lobbying by companies. We take maybe a positive approach here, saying that companies and especially large multinationals on a global scale are so influential and have such a big influence not only on governments but also by their products on consumers, that it's really important to use their strength as a force for good. But that can only be done if their lobbying efforts are very transparently reported on, and it's very clear how they support public health interests. And next slide, please. Another specific topic where we try to implement the framework of the responsible lobbying framework first is the activities by food manufacturers which produce breast milk substitutes for young children, like infant formula or complementary foods. As many of you might know, there is a WHO code on the marketing of breast milk substitutes since 1981, and for now 40 years, there's been a lot of discussion on whether companies are making progress there, but unfortunately, so far the picture is very bleak, so that there's no company which fully complies with the code, and that's partially also because the code has not been translated into government regulation in many countries. But we use this responsible lobbying framework to first of all look at the 9 largest BMS manufacturers and see how they do in terms of lobbying for BMS. And as you can see here, I don't know if the color, the legend is not in the slide, I suppose, but the green bars show the lobbying effort. So let me see if I can. No, I can't. I think the blue one is the policy commitments, and in pink you see management systems. But green is the disclosure on lobbying. So that's I think very much in line with what the fact index that Lucy presented shows. Although the numbers would not be exactly the same, as we obviously have slightly different indicators. Next slide, please. That brings me to the opportunity and the challenges for the future. So we would like to apply this responsible lobbying framework to all the companies in our index in future, not only breast milk substitute manufacturers. And I think the fact that we can now also make use of the fact index and see how we can use that to validate our results and possibly work together with you on that will create opportunities for the future. The other thing we want to do is to see if we can do more performance type of indicators on lobbying on the ground, because we measure now what companies report, but we would also like to see if there's more ways to actually measure how companies do in the political system, and do that at a country level or at a sub-sector level. I think I've passed my 8 minutes, which were assigned to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Time, unfortunately, is short, but I think it's terrific that ATNI is looking at lobbying and looking at it with such sophistication and depth. I think it's really going to serve, hopefully, as a complement to the fact index and vice versa. I think the more independent accountability and monitoring mechanisms we have on lobbying and other forms of corporate political activity, the better. And for a perspective as to why that is, I'm now going to turn it over to Daniel Dorado. Daniel Dorado is a lawyer and the Director of Policy Organizing and Tobacco Campaign with Corporate Accountability. He has more than 10 years of experience in tobacco control, tobacco industry liability, and public health and corporate capture issues. He's based in Quito, Ecuador, and he is the Latin America Article 5.3 expert for the Global Center of Good Governance in Tobacco Control and the Vice President of the Interinstitutional Committee for Tobacco Control, SILA, in Ecuador. Bienvenido, Daniel. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Lucy. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Also, congrats on the launch of the FACT Index. And definitely, Lucy, you have already covered several of the topics that I will want to introduce. But first of all, let's say who I am representing. Corporate Accountability is a US-based organization that basically fights in order to stop transnational corporations from undermining democracy, trampling human rights, and destroying our planet. Next slide, please. And also, I want to start sharing this disclaimer that neither I or the organization which I belong receive any kind of contribution or financial assistance of any type from the tobacco industry, and neither from the food and beverage industry directly or indirectly, and I affirm that I do not have, neither my organization, any affiliation with these types of industries. And today, well, I have been invited to speak a little bit how the Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control could be a starting point in order to address the transparency and accountability concerns that are around the UNFSS summit. In order to this, I will cover a couple of items. Time is always short, but I much hope that I can share some messages around how this precedent for the Global Tobacco Treaty could start addressing many of the worries that civil society has been expressed since the summit was announced, basically because of what Lucy and Mark has already covered, how the big food and agriculture corporations have been dealing in order to interfere in shaping the international policies and national overall. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about corporate capture and its dangers. I will not stop here because I think that Lucy and Mark have covered a lot of what it is currently addressed in this slide, but I will want to start with one of the highlights that Lucy mentioned when she was talking around how the corporate political activity is one of the big food tactics in order to address or interfere in the developing of national food systems. And when Lucy was addressing this, she was referring to a playbook. And this word is a constant word that appears when we refer to how industry interfere in shaping public health policies. And this is very concerned because the use of that power, as it was reflected in the fact index, for sure has huge impact in shaping any type of public health. And what it is, one of the additional concerns is that this playbook is not only replied by the food industry internationally. Let's say that it could be start building from other industries' playbook, and the industry that I am going to refer is the tobacco industry, which, coincidence or not, has been using many of the tactics that Lucy and Mark have very well detailed. For instance, influence elections and candidates, lobbying, using young science, charity, the revolving doors mechanism, and participation as a stakeholder in international and policy-making fora. And I would like to stop in this last one and also in the one that regards to revolving doors, because it really addresses to the space that we are currently, the UNFSS summit. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about big food and agricultural corporations being part of the conversation of an international summit that will address several of the concerns that that the food system requires, it is a really, let's say, worry at the least that they are having a huge spot in the negotiation table, and that they are also, well, as you know, corporations are always seeking for profit, and profit is the motor or the inspiration that address them to in some way move forward many of the policies. But giving the opportunity to participate them without a really strong accountability mechanism, will it allow that the right to health and the public policies could advance? Well, honestly, I think that no. And what you see in this slide is a recent report for the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakri. He presented this report on the Human Rights Council session from February to March this year. And Dr. Fakri was already addressing some of these concerns, no? I will not read all the statement, but basically when he was addressing and referring to the UNFSS summit, especially he was saying, and I will open quotations, from a human rights perspective, there will be no real solutions if the focus is on science and technology, money and markets, without also addressing fundamental questions of inequality, accountability, and governance. And with these three words, I would like to transition to the next slide. So definitely, as I have already mentioned, and I think that it could be unfair when we are addressing to big food and agricultural corporations interference strategies, there are a lot of concerns. And the civil society and indigenous people mechanisms, well, has addressed a couple of letters on regarding these concerns. And well, as you may see in the screen, definitely the concern around adopting strong safeguards against conflict of interest in the UNFSS summit is one of those big challenges. And please, next slide. So how we can start addressing the reference that Dr. Fakri, that civil society, and that these two indexes are referring the fact and the index that Mark referred, well, definitely I think that all of these concerns, this is not one of the answers, no? Civil society has been addressing a lot of concerns regarding to how food systems need to increase, on how civil society needs to be really taking part of this conversation. But I would like to focus on accountability because of the link that I want to, or that I intend to make with the provision of the Global Tobacco Treaty. Definitely, the big food industry is very smart when they are using transparency, no? And definitely this is one of the messages that I want to address here. Transparency needs to be understood as an accountability mechanism that really adopts strong safeguards around conflict of interest provisions. And why the Article 5.3 could be a precedent? Well, the Global Tobacco Treaty adopts these provisions in order to protect the international negotiations and shaping public health policies around tobacco control policies, with a really strong article in an international treaty that basically blocks and prohibits the participation of the tobacco industry. Of course, there are some debates that the big food industry is quite different, but definitely experts, as the former special rapporteur on the right to health has already expressed, that building from the Article 5.3 precedent, recognizing the particularities that the food system and the food policies has, well, definitely we can advance. Next slide, please. And with these last two, I will be ending. So, well, and how we can start this path, no? Definitely, and also as the other co-presenter has addressed, there are really deeply conflict of interest regarding to the food political interference and the recommendations they are providing to governments. Taking into account the precedent of the Global Tobacco Treaty and of course other international instruments with a really human rights perspective approach will really allow to adopt a strong accountability provisions that allow, for instance, that corporations, well, ideally when discussing these policies, honestly, I will suggest that they do not have a spot on the table, but if for some reason they are going to have, that all of this could be transparent, that they, for instance, could express, that all these actions could be recorded, that civil society could be allowed to participate, but also that their concerns are listening. And with this as a starting point, next slide, please. Well, we can adapt on adopting some of these guiding principles, no? They are all referring to the tobacco industry, from the tobacco industry perspective, but definitely I consider that they could be easily to adapt. And the final slide, please. So, well, And saying all of this, I would like to conclude with these three remarks. Definitely, advancing good governance work is a huge challenge in this summit. Civil society and several people's movement around the world that are leading a huge effort in order to expose what is currently happening in the UNF summit, well, are really something that should not be taken as a small consideration and should be like really taken seriously and adopting from the governance body of the summit, well, hearing to their concerns, but also adopting provisions that could allow to protect the summit, but more than all, protect the public health policies that will start being developing from this summit. And finally, there is a huge need to adopt this accountability mechanism with the human rights-based approach that Dr. Fakhri was referring on his reports. Well, thanks again, and I much hope that this could be a starting point for keep building accountability mechanisms.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I think that was a phenomenal tour de force in terms of what is potentially possible when it comes to dealing with the food industry's involvement in policymaking fora, and specifically at the UN Food Systems Summit. And there has been so much controversy around the nature of the engagement of big food and beverage multinationals. So we have had several questions in the Q&A. We won't be able to get to all of them, but there is, I do want to flag one question, and that question comes from Kate Oldridge Turner, who's interested in perspectives about where policymakers are actively welcoming the food and beverage industry as collaborators to develop policy. She gives an example around the EU Code of Conduct for Responsible Food Business and Marketing Practices. So is lobbying in plain sight, where the big food and beverage corporations positioned as partners? I think there's a range of perspectives on this, and I'd be interested, Danielle, Mark, if you want to come in on this particular point, and you can go ahead and turn on your cameras for this discussion. So can the food and beverage corporations be a force for good and lobby and be collaborators with policymakers? Who wants to take that? Mark?
Okay, I can go first if you want, Lucy. I think, yes, I think from my presentation you gather that I and we in ATNI feel that yes, the corporate sector can be a force for good, also on nutrition. And I do have also examples from my time in UNICEF when we were looking at child rights issues in other sectors as well. That, for instance, in Turkey, we did, or we and other parties make use of the force of the large garment manufacturers to lower the age of child labor. Was at the time, I think, in Turkey quite low, and some of the more advanced companies realized that it was also in their interest to increase that age, and therefore I wouldn't say that we always have to combat any type of lobbying by companies, as long as it's transparent, as long as they are very clear about supporting the public health interest and as set by governments.
How about you, Danielle? I imagine the experience on tobacco is quite different, particularly with the Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention. So what are your thoughts on this aspect?
Well, thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Mark. Definitely, when we are referring to lobby, this is a really complex topic because, as you can imagine, even though strong regulations exist, the question that I like to pose is how we will balance the profit interest that will always be behind those ones that are advocating for a big food interest. No, Article 5.3 is really strong on this provision, and basically countries that have adopted that, by the way, are few countries that unfortunately has adopted really strong provisions around lobbying from the tobacco industry. Well, land on the perspective that meetings with tobacco industry should not be happening, and if for some reason they need to happen, they should be conducted with a really high standards of transparency. For instance, I was referring in my presentation to those of some standards. For instance, this session should need to be recorded at the minimum, and also, if not, being able to be a live streaming also, that everyone could see what is happening. Also, well, that every participant in the meeting, well, could have like a clear record of what the industry is saying, but also that what they are saying that could be recorded almost word by word, no that only pieces of the conversation is being recorded. So all this to say that, well, the experience from the tobacco industry, and I think that this applies to other corporations, unfortunately has not demonstrated that they have well intentions. But in the ideal scenario, let's say that they have good intentions and that they are really looking forward to contribute. I think that, well, they should not be afraid of being exposed to this type of mechanisms. And if they agree to participate in this method, well, I think that this is one of the steps, because this needs to be complemented with other additional policy provisions in order to be able, well, to secure accountability through the development of public health policies.
I completely agree. I think whether you stand on the side of, corporations being in the business of lobbying for good, or corporations, needing to stop interfering in any kind of policy making, I think what unites us is there is this incredible need for transparency, given the terrible state of disclosure around information related to corporate political activity. I think as the UN Food System Summit organizers, UN agencies are engaging these big food and beverage manufacturers and agricultural corporations, they should be requiring more information around how these corporations are engaging in the political processes, who they're funding, what trade groups they're a part of, and that sort of thing. And so really, whether criteria around the ATNI score of a food and beverage corporation, or a fact index score, a minimum barrier to entry, so to speak, because I think the time has really come for that kind of transparency. So we're getting a couple more questions in terms of other recommendations for policymakers and governments to take this work forward. And so this is definitely something that we're interested in calling on more government requirements around political transparency and disclosure. I believe we're at time. I don't know if anyone's going to kick us off, but I'd love to maybe get a few more thoughts from each of the panelists, and maybe if we could try to squeeze in a question or two more, even though we are over time, we could try to do that. But I'll turn it over to you, Mark, for some closing reflections.
Yeah, I think thanks, Lucy and Daniel, for your contributions, and I really hope we will manage together to move this agenda forward further. But I think where we see really a gap is that where we see some positive developments, as I mentioned, by some companies, we see that very much focused on home markets only and not on the global markets, and especially from multinationals. It's so important that the good things they might do in their home market are also implemented in low and middle income countries, and that's where we really see a big gap. So that's one remark I wanted to make, and yeah, maybe over to you, Lucy and Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Danielle, any closing thoughts?
Yes, thanks, Lucy. So, well, first of all, regarding to the importance of having tools such as the fact index, no, I think that definitely these types of instruments are quite essential in shaping public health policies because, well, they address, I think, two major items when we are addressing this type of corporations. One, really seeing behind the scenes, no, definitely I'm always very curious why if corporations are really proud to say out loud that they are committed with transparency, why when this type of indexes get into digging in the inside, all these type of aspects appear, no? Why basically what the outcomes of this type of tools basically address that they are hiding something. And I think that this aspect of being hiding is something that is being addressed now that we are talking around the UNFSS summit, that it is highly being addressed by civil society, by farmers, by indigenous people, by NGOs that are really committed with accountability, public health issues. Definitely, I think that when someone has the courage in order to address an affirmation, needs to be consequent with the exposure mechanisms and also be more committed to be able to be able to be exposed to a regulation mechanism in order to advance with in harmony with the right to health provisions. Dr. Fakri in his report was very, I think, redundant about the importance of accountability, inequality, as core pillars to obtain real solutions. Real solutions are not, I think that definitely are not the ones that are behind a profit interest. I think that real solutions are the ones that came from the dialogue, that came from being able to work together if there is a scenario that could give the warranties for that. But more than all, in order so that the planet can advance and that we can protect our community, that we can protect the advancements from a human rights perspective. So definitely I much hope that this summit pays attention to all of these concerns, and also that instruments such as the indexes keep supporting the shaping of the health policies at the national, regional, and global level.
Thank you, Danielle. The final question I'll pick out from the audience here is a question around whether we are contacting companies in the index with the findings. We already have. Prior to launching, we did contact all 10 corporations to ensure that they were aware of this index and that we didn't miss any information that they had already publicly made available. And we offer still the opportunity for those corporations to come back to us with additional information about their spending on lobbying, on electioneering, funding of science, philanthropy. We welcome more information. The world needs to see really more information around corporate political activity. So we will definitely be posting updates with respect to corporate responses. Again, this call to action to try to get those scores closer to 100 stands. So between now and the actual Food System Summit in September, corporations can do a lot by simply just putting information on their websites or making it available to us and to the world to show us how they are using their resources to engage politically. So I know it's a busy day of a lot of side sessions and panel discussions. So I want to thank everybody that attended today for your participation, for your great questions. Really appreciate the support. I want to thank Mark and Danielle for making the time during a very busy period to be part of this today. And finally, thank you to the Feed the Truth team who have worked so hard to pull all this together in a fairly short amount of time. So we look forward to continuing the conversation on social media, and please do be in touch with any additional questions or ideas, and let's make sure we continue to bring the sunlight in to create healthier, fairer food systems for all. Thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful day.